everyone, in this video tutorial I'll show you how to knit a simple shawl using only the garter stitch, but in the center part we have a fancy stitch. This is a triangular shawl, you can see by the shape, but on the top part we have a curve. This curve is made using the short rows. In this tutorial I'll show you how to knit the German short rows to create this kind of shape. To make this shawl, I've used a variegated yarn, and because that you can see the point where I've started making short rows. Because when you knit a short row, you'll see a curve. In this point, you see a straight line because I've knitted only back and forth, but in this point, I've started making my short rows. Using a variegated yarn, it's easily to see where you have done the short rows, but you can use only one color yarn or combine two colors, exactly how I've done during this tutorial. You can see this is the example that we will knit together, and the gray part is where I've started my short rows. And now, before we start knitting the shawl, I want to show you the center part. I've used this kind of fancy stitch that looks like a cable, but it's not. It's only a fancy stitch, and it's very, very easy to knit. And now let's see what we need for this kind of project. To knit my shawl, I've used a cake, only one, and this kind of yarn requires 3.5 to 4 millimeters knitting needles, but I've knit everything using needles of 4.5 millimeters. This cake has 150 grams and 450 meters, in case that you want to knit the shawl using a similar yarn. And now let's start knitting the shawl. I'm using a different yarn, but how I have said on the beginning of this video, I will combine two colors. We will knit from the bottom and we must cast on 3 stitches. After I've cast on 3 stitches, to create a triangular shape, we must increase only on the first stitch of the row on the right and the wrong side using a knit front back stitch. How I've said before, we must increase on the first stitch of this row, and we will make the same in every row until the end of this shawl. Let's make knit front and back stitch. After we have made the increase, we must knit all the remaining stitches. Now we have 4 stitches on the needle, and the next row will be the same like the previous one. We will increase on the first stitch of the needle in the same way that we have made before, making a knit front back stitch. And after we have increased, we will knit all the remaining stitches. Now you must continue knitting in the same way that you have seen, making a knit front back stitch on the first stitch of every row until you have 18 stitches on the needle. Okay, now I have 18 stitches on my needles. You must have the same number, and it's time to put some markers because we will start knitting the fancy stitch on the central part of the shawl, exactly how you have seen on the beginning of this video. This fancy stitch is a multiple of 13 plus 3, and to see the pattern you must work 6 rows. Now I will put a marker on the right side of the shawl because this will be the right side of the shawl. It's time to put a marker that will separate the fancy stitch from the rest of the shawl. The first marker will be put after the first stitch of the needle, and the second marker will be put before the last stitch of the needle. When we start working the fancy stitch on the central part of the shawl, we will continue increasing on the first stitch of every row. That means that we will increase exactly how we have made before on the right side of the shawl and in the wrong side of the shawl, making a knit from back stitch. Increasing in every row, we will obtain a triangular shape. I've made my increase, I will slip the marker, and it's time to start the first row of the fancy stitch. Purl 3, 1, 2, 3, then knit the second stitch from the needle. In this way we will obtain a right inclination. Okay, let's knit the second stitch from the needle. And then knit the first stitch from the needle. If you can see, the stitches are crossing each other and we have a right inclination. Now, knit the next stitch, then we will make the same that we have made before. We will knit the second stitch from the needle, then we will knit the first one. The next two stitches must cross each other, but with a left inclination. To make this, we will knit the second stitch from the needle from back. And then we will knit the first stitch from the needle. Knit the next stitch, then knit the second stitch from back and knit the first stitch from the needle. Purl 3, 1, 2, 3, slip the marker and knit the last stitch from the needle. Now let's start the second row of this fancy stitch. We will increase on the first stitch from the needle as always, making a knit from back stitch, slip the marker and knit 3. 1, 2, 3, slip the next stitch with a yarn in front, purl 2, 1, 2, slip the next stitch with a yarn in front, purl 2, 1, 2, slip the next stitch with a yarn in front, purl 2, 1, 2, and slip the next stitch with a yarn in front. Then knit 3. 1, 2, 3, slip the marker and knit all the remaining stitches from the needle. I'm turning my work because we will start the third row of the fancy stitch, but we will increase on the first stitch from the needle, making a knit from back. We will increase in every row in the right side and in the wrong side, always in the first stitch from the needle. Slip the marker and purl 3. Knit 2, 1, 2, then we will knit the second stitch from the needle with a right inclination, Then knit the first one. Knit 2, 1, 2. Then we will knit the second stitch from the needle with the left inclination. We will knit from the back. After that, knit the first stitch from the needle. Knit 2, 1, 2, and purl 3. 1, 2, 3, slip the marker and knit all the remaining stitches from the needle. Turn your work because we will start the fourth row of the fancy stitch. Increase on the first stitch from the needle, making a front back stitch. Then knit all the stitches until the marker, slip the marker and knit 3. 1, 2, 3. Purl 2, 1, 2. Slip the next stitch with a yarn in front. Purl 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Slip the next stitch with a yarn in front. Purl 2, 1, 2, and knit 3. 1, 2, 3. Slip the marker and knit all the remaining stitches from the needle. Now let's make the fifth row of the fancy stitch, increasing in the first stitch from the needle, making a knit from back stitch. Knit all the stitches until the marker, slip the marker and purl 3. 1, 2, 3. Knit the next stitch, then knit the second stitch from the needle with a right inclination, and knit the first stitch from the needle. Knit 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, then knit the second stitch from the needle with the left inclination. We will knit the stitch from back and then knit the first one. Knit the next stitch and purl 3. 1, 2, 3. Slip the marker and knit all the remaining stitches from the needle. Okay, let's turn the work because we will start the last row of this fancy stitch. Increase on the first stitch from the needle as always, making a knit from back stitch. Knit all the stitches until the marker, slip the marker and knit 3. 1, 2, 3. Purl the next stitch, slip the next stitch with a yarn in front, purl 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Slip the next stitch with a yarn in front, purl 1 and knit 3. 1, 2, 3. Slip the marker and knit all the remaining stitches from the needle. Now you must continue in the same way that you have seen until now, repeating from the fourth row to the sixth row. until you have a total of 33 centimeter. You must measure from the point that you have cast on your stitches. You must have a total of 33 centimeter. I've knitted for a couple of centimeter, but you must have a bigger piece than mine. I'm doing only a little example here. But you must have a piece that measure 33 centimeter. Now it's time to make the short rows, German short rows, but I'm including a second color because I want that you see where is the point where I'm doing these short rows. This is the shawl that you have seen on the beginning of this video, and this is the point where I've started making my short rows. Okay, how I've said before, I'm including a second color because I want that you can see what I'm doing, but you can make this kind of shawl using two colors or multiple colors to have an interesting look. We will make the short rows only where is the garter stitch. The central part, where is the fancy stitch, everything will remain how it is. We will start with this side of the shawl, then we will pass on the other side. Let's put 10 markers on this side of the shawl. The markers will be put on the stitch, on the returning stitch. I'm putting the first marker on the stitch before the marker that separate the fancy stitch from the rest of the shawl. Then I will slip 3 stitches from the marker, the blue marker. We slip 3 stitches, and in the 4th stitch I'm putting the second marker. Then slip 3, and in the 4th stitch we will put the 3rd marker. You must continue in this way until you have 10 markers. I'm putting only 5 because I'm doing a little example here. I've put my 5 markers, but I remember you that you must have 10 markers on this side of the shawl because you must have 10 returning stitches. I'm doing only a little example here. I've changed my color. I'm doing the short rows with a second color, and we will start making an increase on the first stitch from the row, making 1 front back stitch. This will remain always the same until the end of the shawl. Now I'm knitting all the stitches until the first marker that we have put it in here. If you want, when you knit the stitch, where is the marker in this case, you can take the marker and put it on the actual stitch. Because when you knit back and forth making short rows, those markers are going down. But if you can see, I'm not putting the markers on the actual stitches. This is because when we do German short rows, we can see very clearly where we have made the returning stitch on the previous short row. I'm taking off my first marker because that stitch will be the returning stitch. And to make a German short row, we must knit the returning stitch as normal. Then I'm turning my work, and I will put the first stitch from the left needle on the right side. I bring my yarn on the back side of my work, pulling the thread. We will create 2 stitches. Then continue knitting all the remaining stitches from the needle. Okay, I will show you again how to make a short row. We will knit all the stitches until the last marker, And this is the point where we have created 2 stitches, the returning stitch. Let's start as always increasing on the first stitch from the needle, making a knit front back stitch. Then knit all the stitches until the last marker. Okay, I'm ready to knit my returning stitch. That will be my fourth stitch from the previous returning stitch. You can take off your marker and knit the returning stitch. That means it's the fourth stitch from the previous returning stitch that we have made on the first short row. Now I'm knitting, I'm turning my work, and I will put the first stitch on the right needle. Pulling the yarn on the back side of my work. In this way I'm creating 2 stitches. Then I will continue knitting until the end. I have finished knitting my second short row and now I'm doing the third one. We will start as always increasing on the first stitch from the needle, then knit all the stitches until the last marker. If you can see, my markers went down during the short rows, but I'm looking for the last returning stitch that I have made before, and I'm counting 3 stitches, and the fourth one will be the actual returning stitch. I'm knitting this stitch and turn my work. And to make the German shearl, I'm putting the first stitch on the right needle, pulling the yarn on the back side. In this way we'll create 2 stitches. Then I'm continue knitting until the end. Now you must continue making your short rows exactly how you have seen before until you have finished all your markers. That means that you will have 10 returning stitches. And this is how it looks, my shawl, after I've done my shorter rows, but you must have a bigger piece than mine. And now we will do the same thing on the other side of the shawl. I've changed my color and I will start increasing on the first stitch from the needle. Then knit all the stitches until the fancy stitch that we have on the central part of the shawl. And now you'll see the returning stitches that we have made making the short rows. This is a returning stitch that looks like 2 stitches, but is only 1. I'm knitting the next stitch and I will knit the returning stitch exactly the same. And I'm continue knitting exactly how you have seen until now. This is the first returning stitch that I've made. I slip the marker and continue knitting my fancy stitch. You must remember what was the last row that you have done. I finished knitting the pattern of the fancy stitch, but I'm changing color exactly now in this point, because when I'm knitting a garter stitch, I prefer to change color on the right side of my work. If we change color on the other side, we will have this kind of look on the right side of the shawl. Now I'm continuing knitting using the second color, then we can start the short rows in this side. To make the short rows in this side of the shawl, you must make the same that you have done on the other side. Put your 10 markers at the same distance. We will start putting the first marker on the marker before the fancy stitch. Then slip 3, 1, 2, 3, and the fourth. In the fourth stitch we will put the second marker. Then you go in this way, slipping 3 stitches, and in the fourth stitch you put your marker. Continue like this until you have put all your 10 markers. Then make your German short rows exactly how you have done on the other side. Start increasing as always on the first stitch from the needle, making a knit front back stitch, then knit all the stitches until the first marker that you have put on there. Then continue in the same way that you have done on the other side. And this is how it looks, my example, after I've done the short rows in both sides. Now we must make another repetition, exactly the same, making short rows in both sides. I'm changing color to make another repetition of short rows. In this moment, I will knit the back side of the shawl and we will start making the short rows on the other side. Now I'm on the right side of the shawl and I will start making my short row exactly how I've done before. I will put 10 markers on the same distance. I'm putting the first marker on the stitch before the fancy stitch. Then I slip 3 stitches and on the fourth I will put the second marker. Continue like this until you have all 10 markers on this side of the shawl. Then make your short rows exactly the same and make the same thing on the other side. That means that we have done a second repetition of short rows in both sides. I finished making my second repetition of short rows and this is how it looks until now. But you must have a bigger piece than mine. I remember you that I'm doing only a little example. After we have done 2 repetitions of short rows in both sides, we must continue knitting back and forth without any short rows, making the increase in the first stitch of the needle in every row until we have a total of 48 centimeters. Okay, after you have knit for 48 centimeters, we must make another repetition of short rows. But instead to put 10 markers on both sides, we will put only 5, exactly how I've done for my example here. And the last repetition of these short rows will be the same that you have seen during this tutorial. After you have done the last repetition of short rows in both sides, we can cast off the stitches. To make my cast off, I will knit the first stitch from the needle, then knit the second stitch and bring the first stitch over the second one. I'm knitting the next stitch and I'm doing the same, and after I cast off 2 stitches I will knit an yarn over. In this way we will create an elastic cast off. That means that we cast off 2 stitches and we knit an yarn over until the end. After you have cast off all the stitches, you must block the shawl. It's very important to not avoid this part, because blocking the shawl you will have a better look. The tutorial is over. I hope that you have enjoyed this kind of video. If you have any question, you can put it down on the comment section, and I see you the next time. Bye bye.